Every parent knows the ache of watching their child struggle in a world that doesn't understand them. For 3 years, Catherine has carried that weight alone, sitting on a dusty platform beside her mute daughter Emma, invisible to a town that has forgotten how to see them. The afternoon stage arrives, and a weathered mountain man steps down onto the platform. He walks toward them with quiet purpose, kneels before Emma, and begins moving his hands in graceful signs. Emma's eyes light up for the first time in years. Catherine's breath catches. This stranger speaks her daughter's language. Who is this man who carries such unexpected grace? How does a rugged mountain man know sign language? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Catherine Brennan had learned to measure time differently since Thomas died. Not in hours or days, but in the small rituals that kept her and Emma alive. Monday meant collecting mending from Mrs. Hartwell's general store. Tuesday brought alterations for the banker's wife. Wednesday through Friday, she sewed in the cramped room above the livery stable, her fingers moving steadily through fabric while Emma sat in the corner with her cloth doll. The one Thomas had bought her 4th birthday. It was the doll Catherine noticed first each morning when she woke. Emma clutched it even in sleep, her small fingers wrapped around its faded body. The doll had once worn a blue calico dress that matched Emma's eyes. Now both were worn thin, the color leached out by time and the girl's constant touch. Catherine understood that grip. She held tight to things too. Cedar Falls, Wyoming Territory, 1882. The town sat in a valley where pine-covered mountains met grassland, where the Cedar River ran clear and cold from the high country. A place of severe beauty, Catherine thought, though she had stopped noticing the scenery years ago. Survival had a way of narrowing your vision to what was immediately necessary. Food, shelter, keeping. Your child safe in a world that had no patience for difference. The platform where they sat each. Afternoon was weathered grey. The wood smooth from decades of boots and cargo. Catherine came here because Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, sometimes needed work done on linens. The supply wagon arrived Tuesdays and Fridays, and Mrs. Henderson met it personally to check her orders. It was Catherine's best chance to catch her, to remind her she existed, to ask if there was work. Emma never complained about the waiting. She sat perfectly still, her doll in her lap, watching the world with those blue eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. 8 years old now, and she had not spoken since the day her father died. Catherine could still see it when she closed her eyes. The lumber mill where Thomas worked, the massive log rolling free from its chain, Thomas pushing young Billy Cooper out of the way, the sickening crack of wood against bone. Emma had been there, bringing her father his lunch pail, standing close enough to see everything, close enough that her father's last word was her name. After that day, Emma's voice simply disappeared. Doc Patterson examined her thoroughly, found nothing physically wrong. The voice was there, he assured Catherine. The child just could not find her way back to it. Or would not. Grief worked mysteriously in the young, he said. Give her time. 3 years was a long time. Catherine reached into her pocket and pulled out Thomas's watch. Silver with an engraved cover that bore his initials. She opened it, checked the time, 2:30, and wound the mechanism carefully. She did this every day at the same time. The watch had stopped the moment Thomas died, the jeweler told her. Shattered crystal, broken mainspring. He had repaired it, charged her nothing, offered his condolences. Now Catherine wound it daily, kept it running. As if this small act could keep some part of Thomas alive. Mrs. Brennan, the voice was sharp, disapproving. Catherine looked up to find Mrs. Hartwell standing over them, her considerable bulk blocking the afternoon sun. The woman owned the general store and considered herself the arbiter of Cedar Falls's moral standards. She held a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Mrs. Hartwell. Catherine stood, brushing dust from her skirt. It was her second-best dress, which meant it was merely worn rather than patched. She saved her best dress for church, where appearance mattered most. I've brought the mending. Mrs. Hartwell set the basket down with more force than necessary. 7 items. I'll need them by Monday. Of course. Catherine reached for the basket. The stitching on the last batch was adequate. But I did find one seam that seemed hurried. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes were cold behind her spectacles. I trust you'll take more care this time. Catherine's throat tightened. The seam had been perfect. She had checked it twice. I always take care with my work. Mrs. Hartwell's gaze dropped to Emma, who sat motionless, still holding her doll. The child looks piqued. Perhaps some fresh air would do her good. Though I suppose she gets plenty, sitting out here day after day, where everyone can see. The criticism was clear. Decent women did not loiter in public spaces. Decent women kept their strange children at home, out of sight. Emma enjoys watching the town, Catherine said quietly. It was not quite a lie. Emma watched everything with that intense, silent attention. Whether she enjoyed it, Catherine could not say. They had so few ways to communicate, I'm sure. Mrs. Hartwell sniffed. Well, Monday then. And do mind that stitching. She swept away, her skirts raising small clouds of dust. Catherine waited until she was gone before sitting back down. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the basket. Inside were shirts and a coat, all needing buttons replaced or tears mended. Simple work. Work she could do with her eyes closed. Work that would earn her perhaps $2 if Mrs. Hartwell was feeling generous. $2 was 3 days' food. It was not rent. It was not new shoes for Emma, whose toes were starting to press against the leather. It was not the security Catherine dreamed about in the dark hours before dawn. Mama? Emma's hands moved in a gesture Catherine had learned to recognize. A twist of the fingers that meant question, confusion, hurt. It's all right, sweetheart. Catherine tucked the basket beside her and pulled Emma close. The girl fit perfectly against her side, warm and small and silent. Mrs. Hartwell just likes to be particular. It's not about you, but it was about Emma, and they both knew it. The whole town had opinions about the widow Brennan and her strange, mute child. Poor thing, they said, and not kindly. What will become of her? What will become of them both? Reverend Cole at least meant well. He stopped by their room once a month, bringing scripture and concern in equal measure. God had a plan, he assured Catherine. This trial would pass. Emma would speak again when the Lord willed it. In the meantime, prayer was the answer. Prayer and patience, Catherine prayed. She prayed every night, kneeling beside Emma's narrow bed, asking God to give her daughter back her voice, asking God to show her how to reach the child who lived in silence, asking God, sometimes, why he had taken Thomas and left her alone with a burden too heavy to carry. She felt guilty about that last prayer. Emma was not a burden. Emma was her heart walking around outside her body. But raising a child alone in a frontier town, with no husband and no prospects and no way to communicate, beyond the simplest gestures, that was a burden that bent Catherine's spine and grayed her hair before its time, Doc. Patterson was the only person who treated them with genuine kindness. He had examined Emma twice without charge, and he always tipped his hat when he passed them on the street. Once he had stopped and crouched down to Emma's level, showing her a smooth riverstone he carried in his pocket. He told her it was for luck, and did she think it was working? Emma had smiled, actually smiled, and touched the stone with one careful finger. The doctor had pressed it into her hand as a gift. Emma kept it in her pocket with her doll. Catherine heard it click against the watch chain sometimes when Emma moved. 2 talismans against a difficult world. The afternoon stretched long. Catherine sewed a button back on one of Mrs. Hartwell's husband's shirts, her needle flashing in the sunlight. Emma leaned against her, thumb in her mouth, a habit from babyhood she had never outgrown. Catherine did not have the heart to correct it. What did it matter if the child found comfort where she could? At 4 o'clock, the supply wagon came rattling down the main street. Mrs. Henderson climbed down from her buggy where she had been waiting outside the telegraph office. She inspected her deliveries, signed the freight papers, and finally noticed Catherine standing nearby with her sewing basket. Mrs. Brennan, I wondered if I might see you today. I hoped you might have some work. Ma'am, Catherine kept her voice steady, professional. I've finished the last of your linens. Yes, and they were well done. Mrs. Henderson was a practical woman, neither warm nor cold. She ran her boarding house like a business and expected others to do the same. "I have 6 more pillowcases that need embroidery. Simple work, but it needs a careful hand. Can you manage it?" "Yes, ma'am." "When would you need them?" "End of next week. I'm preparing rooms for the timber contractors coming in from the east. They expect a certain standard." Timber contractors. Catherine's heart sank. That meant men in the boarding house, men with money and expectations. That meant Mrs. Henderson would be particular about the quality of the work, and particular about payment if anything was less than perfect. "I can have them ready," Catherine said. "Good. Come by tomorrow and collect them." Mrs. Henderson glanced down at Emma, her expression unreadable. "Your girl is well?" "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for asking." Mrs. Henderson turned back to her deliveries, the conversation clearly over. Catherine gathered their things as the afternoon began its slow decline toward evening. The shadows grew longer across the platform. The air cooled. Emma stirred and pointed toward home, a small gesture, but Catherine understood it. Time to go. Time to return to their room, to the evening ritual of soup and bread, to the hours of sewing by lamplight while Emma slept. They walked slowly through town. Catherine nodded to the few people who acknowledged them, most simply looked away or through them, as if a widow and her silent child had no more substance than ghosts. Perhaps that was what they were becoming, insubstantial, disappearing a little more each day into the spaces between other people's lives. Their room was on the 2nd floor of the livery stable, accessed by an outside staircase that creaked with every step. It was a single room with a tiny cookstove, 2 narrow beds, a table, and a trunk that held everything they owned. Not much to show for 30 years of living, Catherine thought sometimes. But it was clean, and it was theirs, and the rent was $7 a month she could barely afford. She set the basket on the table and lit the lamp. Emma went immediately to the window, pressing her face against the glass to watch the street below. This was her favorite time of day, when the light turned gold and the town slowed its frantic pace. Catherine watched her daughter's reflection in the glass, the small face, the serious eyes, the absolute silence that surrounded her like an invisible wall. "We'll be all right," Catherine said softly, to herself as much as to Emma. "We've managed this long. We'll keep managing." Emma turned from the window and crossed the room.
She took her mother's hand and pressed it against her own cheek.
It was a gesture of comfort, or perhaps reassurance. Catherine's eyes burned with sudden tears. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "We'll be all right." She believed it most days. She had to believe it. The alternative was a darkness she could not allow herself to enter. So she wound Thomas's watch, and she sewed Mrs. Hartwell's mending, and she sat on the platform each afternoon waiting for work that came in dribs and drabs. She measured time in small rituals and smaller mercies, and she tried not to think about the future, which stretched ahead like an empty road leading nowhere she wanted to go. Friday afternoon brought the stagecoach, rattling into Cedar Falls with a cloud of dust, and the driver's shouted greeting. Catherine and Emma sat in their usual spot on the platform, Catherine sewing in her lap, Emma watching with patient attention. The stage was early today, which meant the mountain roads had been dry and the horses fresh. 3 passengers climbed down. A drummer with his sample case, a woman in traveling clothes who was met immediately by her husband, and a man who moved with the careful economy of someone accustomed to difficult terrain. He was tall, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat simply. His clothes were practical. Wool shirt, canvas pants, boots that had seen considerable miles. A hat shadowed his face, but Catherine could see a beard streaked with grey and eyes that took in everything with quiet assessment. He carried a single pack and a bedroll, travelling light. A working man, she judged, probably one of the timber contractors Mrs. Henderson had mentioned. The man collected his belongings and stood for a moment, orienting himself to the town. His gaze swept across the street, the buildings, the people going about their business. Then his eyes found Emma. Catherine saw the moment of recognition. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes. He looked at Emma for a long moment, then at Catherine, then back to Emma. He set down his pack and walked directly toward them. Catherine's hand instinctively moved to Emma's shoulder. Strangers did not approach them. The town had learned to keep its distance from the widow and her strange child. But this man walked with purpose, his steps steady and sure, and there was something in his face that was not threat, but something else entirely. He stopped a few feet away and removed his hat. His hair was dark, shot through with silver. His face was weathered, lined by sun and wind and years, late 40s perhaps. His eyes were grey, steady, and remarkably kind. "Mom," he said to Catherine, his voice low and gravelled. Then he turned to Emma, and his hands began to move. Catherine's breath caught. She had seen gestures before, of course. People pointed, waved, made shapes in the air when words failed them. But this was different. This was deliberate, structured, purposeful. The man's hands moved in fluid patterns, his fingers forming shapes that clearly meant something, a language. Emma's entire body went rigid. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened slightly in shock. Then slowly, tentatively, her own hands began to move in response. Catherine felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She watched her daughter's hands shape patterns in the air, watched the man nod and respond with his own gestures, watched a conversation unfold in complete silence. Emma's face transformed. The usual careful blankness gave way to animation, to curiosity, to something that looked painfully like joy. "What?" Catherine's voice came out rough. She cleared her throat. "What are you doing?" The man's hands stilled. He turned to her, and there was understanding in his eyes. "Signing, ma'am. Sign language. Your daughter is deaf, I assume." No, she can hear perfectly well. She can't." Catherine found herself unable to finish the sentence. The words tangled in her throat. "She doesn't speak," the man said gently. It was not a question, not since her father died. 3 years ago. She saw it happen, and after that, Catherine gestured helplessly. "Nothing. The doctor says there's nothing wrong with her physically, but she just won't talk." The man looked at Emma again, and his expression held something Catherine recognized. Grief, old and worn smooth by time, but grief nonetheless. "My wife was deaf," he said quietly. "Born that way. I learned to sign so we could talk to each other. When I saw your daughter sitting so still, watching everything, I know that look. That's how my Sarah used to watch the world. Taking it all in, seeing everything, but locked behind glass." Emma's hands moved again, a quick flutter of shapes. The man smiled, a small, sad expression, and signed back. Emma nodded eagerly, then turned to Catherine with an expression of desperate pleading. "She's asking if I can teach you," the man said. "If you'd be willing to learn, so you can talk to each other this way." Catherine looked at her daughter, at the hope blazing in those blue eyes, at the way Emma's hands were already moving again, forming words Catherine could not understand, could not answer. 3 years of silence, 3 years of guessing what Emma needed, what she felt, what she thought. 3 years of watching her child retreat further and further into a world Catherine could not reach. "Yes," Catherine said, and her voice broke. "Yes, please. I'll learn anything." "Just please," the man nodded. He set his hat back on his head and extended his hand to Catherine. "James Coulter. I'm here to work the timber contracts up in the high country. I'll be in Cedar Falls at least through the season." Catherine shook his hand. His grip was firm but not crushing, calloused from hard work. "Catherine Brennan. This is Emma." Emma was staring at James Coulter with an intensity that might have been unsettling if it were not so obviously born of desperate hunger. Hunger to be understood. Hunger to speak, even if her voice had been lost. "Pleased to meet you both," James said. He looked around the platform, at the town beyond. "Is there somewhere we might talk? Somewhere more private? I'd be happy to show you some basic signs right now, if you're willing. The alphabet, some simple words." "It's a start," Catherine's mind raced. Their room was tiny, barely appropriate for entertaining a strange man. But the alternative was sitting here on the platform, where the whole town could watch and speculate and judge. Mrs. Hartwell would have a field day. Then again, Mrs. Hartwell would judge regardless. And this man was offering something Catherine had thought impossible. A way to reach Emma, a way to hear her daughter's voice, even if it came through hands instead of speech. "There's a grove of cottonwoods by the river," Catherine said. "Just at the edge of town. It's quiet there. Would that suit?" "That would be fine," James said. He collected his pack and bedroll, shouldering them with easy strength. "Lead the way." They walked through town, the three of them. Catherine was acutely aware of the stairs, the way conversations paused as they passed, the way Mrs. Hartwell stood in the doorway of her store with her arms crossed and her mouth pinched in disapproval. Let them stare, let them talk. For the first time in 3 years, Catherine did not care what the town thought. Emma walked between them, her hand in Catherine's, her eyes fixed on James Coulter as if he might vanish if she looked away. The cottonwood grove was cool and shaded, the river running shallow and clear over smooth stones. Catherine spread her shawl on the ground, and they sat in a small circle. James pulled a leather-bound journal from his pack, its cover worn soft with handling. "This was my wife's," he said, opening it to reveal pages covered in careful drawings, and in various positions, each labeled with a word. "She made it for me when I was learning, drew every sign she knew, organized them by category. It took her 2 years to complete." He handed the journal to Catherine. She touched the pages reverently. Each drawing was meticulous, labeled in a woman's neat handwriting. Hello, thank you, love, mother, father, home, hundreds of words, each one a key to a locked door. "Start with the alphabet," James said. His hands formed a shape, thumb and forefinger curved, other fingers curled. "This is A," another shape. "This is B." Catherine watched, memorized, tried to copy. Her fingers felt clumsy, uncertain. Emma moved close, taking Catherine's hands and gently reshaping them into the correct positions. The girl's touch was patient, encouraging. James worked through the alphabet slowly, making Catherine repeat each letter until she had it right. Then he showed her simple words. "Yes, no, please, thank you." "Mother, daughter, Emma," Catherine signed, the letters slow but deliberate. Emma's face lit up. Her hands moved in response, and James translated. "She says you're doing well. She's proud of you." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. 3 years. 3 years of silence, and now this small bridge beginning to form. Emma reached over and took her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. They worked until the light began to fade. James was patient, methodical, repeating signs until Catherine could reproduce them without help. Emma watched everything, occasionally adding her own signs, teaching her mother the way James was teaching them both. Finally, as the shadows grew long, James closed the journal. "That's enough for today. Learning a language takes time, but you've made a good start. When can we meet again?" Catherine asked. The question came out more desperate than she intended. James considered. "I need to check in with the timber office, get my work assignment. But I could come back Sunday afternoon if that suits you, after church services." "Yes," Catherine said immediately. "Yes, that would be perfect." James stood, brushing grass from his pants. He looked down at Emma, who was still sitting cross-legged on the shawl, her hands moving in a question. James signed back, a brief exchange, and Emma nodded, satisfied. "She asked if I'd really come back," James said to Catherine. "I told her I promised." He shouldered his pack and touched the brim of his hat. "Until Sunday then, Mrs. Brennan." "Please," Catherine said. "Or call me Catherine." Something shifted in his expression. A softening, perhaps, or recognition. "Catherine, then. I'm James." They watched him walk back toward town, his figure growing smaller in the gathering dusk. Emma stood and began signing rapidly, her hands flying through shapes Catherine could not yet understand. But the message was clear in her daughter's face. Hope, excitement, the desperate joy of someone who had been drowning and suddenly found air. Catherine pulled Emma close, burying her face in her daughter's hair. "We're going to learn," she whispered. "We're going to learn how to talk to each other. Really talk. I promise." Emma pulled back and looked at her mother. Her hands moved in the sign James had taught them, slowly, deliberately, making sure Catherine understood. "Thank you." Catherine signed it back, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you." That night, back in their room above the livery stable, Catherine lit the lamp and opened Mrs. Hartwell's basket of mending. But instead of sewing, she pulled out a piece of paper and began to draw, hands in different positions, the letters of the alphabet, as best as she could remember them. The words James had taught them. Emma sat beside her, guiding her mother's pencil, correcting the drawings, adding details Catherine had missed. They worked together in lamplight, building the beginning of a language that would let them finally hear each other. Outside, Cedar Falls settled into its evening rhythms. But inside that small room, something new was being born. A bridge across 3 years of silence. A way forward Catherine had not dared to imagine. She looked at Emma, at her daughter's face bent over the paper in concentration, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. Sunday afternoon arrived with the slow certainty of seasons changing. Catherine had attended morning services with Emma, sitting in their usual pew at the back, where the widow and her silent child would not disturb anyone. Reverend Cole had preached about patience and God's mysterious ways, and Catherine had barely heard a word. Her mind was full of handshapes and the possibility of conversation. James arrived at their room precisely at 2 o'clock. Catherine heard his boots on the stairs and opened the door before he could knock. He held his hat in one hand and a small cloth bundle in the other. "Afternoon," he said. "I hope I'm not early, right on time." Catherine stepped back to let him in. The room suddenly felt smaller with his presence, his quiet solidity filling the space. Emma stood by the table, practically vibrating with excitement. James greeted Emma with a quick series of signs. Her response was immediate, her hands moving in patterns Catherine was beginning to recognize. A conversation unfolded between them, and Catherine stood to the side, understanding nothing, feeling the old familiar ache of exclusion. James must have seen it in her face. He turned to her and signed slowly, spelling out each letter. I asked how she was. She said she's been practicing. We both have, Catherine said. She showed him the papers spread across the table, covered with her attempts at drawing the hand positions from his wife's journal. Some were accurate. Others were crude approximations. James studied them with care. These are good. You've got most of them right. Here. He took the pencil and corrected a few drawings, his hand steady and sure. The thumb position matters. Small differences change the meaning. Emma pulled at James's sleeve, pointing to the cloth bundle he had set on the table. He smiled and unwrapped it, revealing a piece of wood, pine, smooth and fragrant, and a small carving knife. I thought Emma might like to see how something is made, he said. If that's all right with you, Catherine. Of course. They sat at the table, James in the middle with Emma and Catherine on either side. He showed them the wood first, running his fingers along the grain, demonstrating how to feel the direction of growth. Then he took the knife and began to carve, his movements precise and controlled. My wife taught me patience, James said as he worked. Before Sarah, I was all rough edges. Quick to anger, quick to act. She showed me that some things can't be rushed. Language is like that. Carving is like that. You have to work with the material, not against it. The wood began to take shape under his hands. Wings emerged, a beak, the curve of a small body. Catherine watched, fascinated, as a bird slowly appeared from the block of pine. Emma's hands moved in a question. James paused in his carving to sign back, a longer exchange than before. Emma nodded eagerly and held out her hands. James placed the wooden knife in them carefully, his larger hands guiding her smaller ones, showing her the angle of the blade, the pressure needed. What did she ask? Catherine said, if she could try. James kept his hands over Emma's, helping her make the first careful cut. She's got steady hands. That's good. They worked together, James guiding, Emma learning. Catherine watched her daughter's face, the intense concentration, the way she bit her lower lip just as Thomas used to do when he was focused on a task. The memory hit Catherine like a physical blow, sudden and sharp. Thomas had been a craftsman too, his woodworking tools still stored in the barn at the homestead they had abandoned after his death. My husband was a carpenter, Catherine said quietly. He loved working with wood. Made our table, the chairs, Emma's cradle. He was going to teach her his trade when she got older. James looked up from the carving. His eyes held understanding. What happened to him? If you don't mind my asking. Catherine found she did not mind. The story wanted to be told, perhaps. Or perhaps James Coulter was someone who knew about loss and would not offer empty comfort, Lumber mill accident. A log broke free from its chain. Thomas pushed a young man out of the way and took the impact himself. Emma was there. She had brought his lunch. Catherine's voice remained steady. She had told this story before, to the doctor, to the reverend, to the few people who asked. But saying it now, to this quiet man who carved birds from pine, felt different. After that day, she never spoke again. Doc Patterson says the shock of it locked her voice away. Says it might come back someday or it might not. We just have to wait and see. James was quiet for a moment, his hands still guiding Emma's. Then he said, "My Sarah died of pneumonia 5 years ago, up in the mountains where I was working a timber claim. Winter came early that year, caught us unprepared. By the time I got her down to a doctor, her lungs were too far gone. She died 3 days later." He paused in the carving, his jaw tight. "I went back up the mountain after that. Built a cabin in the high country, stayed away from people. Figured if I couldn't save the one person who mattered, there wasn't much point in being around anyone else." "What changed?" Catherine asked. "Time, I suppose. And the fact that staying angry at the world doesn't bring anyone back." James resumed, guiding Emma's hands. "I came down because winter's coming again, and I'm tired of being alone. Thought I'd take some timber work, maybe remember how to be around people again. Then I saw Emma on that platform and I recognized something. The way she watches. The way Sarah used to watch. And I thought maybe I could help." Emma lifted her head, looking between them. Her hands moved in a question directed at James. He signed back, and Emma's expression softened. She reached over and patted his hand. A small gesture of comfort from a child who understood grief even if she could not speak about it. "She asked if I miss Sarah," James said. "I told her every day." They returned to the carving. The bird took more definite shape. A small songbird, wings slightly spread as if about to take flight. James made the final cuts himself, smoothing the rough edges, bringing out the details. When he finished, he placed it in Emma's hands. "For you," he said, signing the words as he spoke them. "So you remember that silent things can still be beautiful." Emma cradled the bird carefully. Her hands moved in response, and she looked at her mother expectantly. "She says thank you," Catherine said, recognizing the sign. "Almost," James corrected gently. "She says thank you, and she wants to learn to make one herself." "We'll need more lessons then," Catherine said. She met James's eyes. "If you're willing to keep coming back." "I'm willing." James began to clean wood shavings from the table. "I've taken a room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. I'll be around through the season at least. We can meet here or at the grove by the river, wherever you're comfortable. I can come by twice a week if that suits. Tuesday and Sunday afternoons," Catherine suggested. Those were her slowest days for sewing work. "Tuesday and Sunday it is." They spent the rest of the afternoon on sign language. James taught them verbs: walk, sit, eat, sleep. He showed them how to form simple sentences, how to ask questions, how to express emotion. Catherine's hands felt clumsy at first, but gradually she began to find the rhythm of it. The way signs flowed into each other, the grammar that was different from spoken English, but had its own elegant logic. Emma was a better student. Her hands moved with natural grace, picking up signs after seeing them only once or twice. She asked questions constantly, her fingers shaping inquiries faster than James could answer them. Catherine watched her daughter bloom, saw the intelligence and curiosity that had been locked behind 3 years of enforced silence, finally finding expression. When the light began to fade and James prepared to leave, Emma signed something complex, her face serious. James signed back, equally serious, then turned to Catherine. She asked if I promised to come back Tuesday. I told her I promise. After James left, Emma kept the carved bird with her constantly. She held it while Catherine prepared their simple supper. She set it beside her plate during the meal. When bedtime came, she placed it carefully on the small shelf beside her bed, where she kept her cloth doll and the river stone from Doc Patterson. Catherine tucked her daughter in, smoothing the hair back from her forehead. Emma's hands moved in the dim lamplight, forming signs they had learned that afternoon. "I love you," Catherine thought she recognized, and she signed it back with her clumsy, unpracticed hands. Emma smiled and closed her eyes. one hand resting on the carved bird. Catherine sat at the table for a long time after Emma fell asleep, practicing signs in the lamplight. Her fingers formed letters, words, simple phrases. The movements felt foreign still, but less impossible than they had seemed just days ago. She thought about James Coulter, this quiet man who had appeared from nowhere and offered them a bridge across silence. There was something steady about him, something trustworthy. He had known profound loss and survived it. He understood what it meant to be isolated, to live on the outside of normal life, and he had not looked at Emma with pity or discomfort. He had looked at her with recognition, with respect, with the understanding that silence was not the same as emptiness. Catherine pulled out Thomas's watch, opened the cover, wound the mechanism. The familiar ritual steadied her, connected her to the past, even as the future was beginning to shift into new and unexpected shapes. 3 years she had been frozen, unable to move forward, unable to truly reach her daughter. Now suddenly movement seemed possible. Communication seemed possible. Perhaps even something more, though Catherine barely dared to name what that might be. She closed the watch and set it on the table. Tomorrow would bring more sewing, more judgment from Mrs. Hartwell, more of the daily struggle to survive. But now there was also Tuesday to look forward to. Another lesson, another chance to hear her daughter's voice. Even if it came through hands instead of words, it was enough. For now it was enough. 6 weeks passed like water over stone, gradually reshaping the landscape of their lives. James came every Tuesday and Sunday without fail, climbing the stairs to their room above the livery stable, his quiet presence becoming as reliable as the seasons. Catherine's fingers grew more confident with each lesson, the signs becoming second nature rather than conscious effort. Emma flourished. The silent, watchful child began to emerge as someone else entirely, curious, funny, surprisingly opinionated. Through sign language, Catherine discovered her daughter had thoughts about everything. Emma did not like Mrs. Hartwell's judgmental stares. She thought Reverend Cole's sermons were too long. She missed her father every day, but was glad to have a way to say so. She loved the mountains and wanted to see them up close. She thought James was kind and wondered if he was lonely. That last observation had caught Catherine off guard. They had been sitting at the table, practicing conversation, when Emma signed the question. James had paused, his hands still, his expression thoughtful. "Yes," he signed back. "I'm lonely sometimes, but less now." They began to share meals occasionally. Nothing planned or formal, just James staying after a lesson, Catherine offering what simple food she had, the three of them eating together at the small table. James always brought something to contribute. Fresh bread from the bakery, apples from a farm outside town. Once a jar of honey, he said, came from the mountain wildflowers. Catherine found herself looking forward to these meals more than she cared to admit. There was comfort in the routine of it, in having another adult presence in the room. James was easy company. He did not talk much, but when he did, his words carried weight. He listened more than he spoke, and his attention was complete when he gave it. The town naturally noticed. Mrs. Hartwell made her disapproval clear when Catherine came to collect mending. "I've heard the mountain man is a regular visitor to your room, Mrs. Brennan. I do hope you understand how that appears." Catherine kept her voice level. "Mr. Coulter is teaching Emma and me sign language. It's been a blessing for my daughter. I'm sure it has. Nevertheless, a widow must be mindful of her reputation, particularly a widow with a child to consider." The words stung because they carried truth. Cedar Falls was a small town with small-town sensibilities. A widow entertaining a single man in her room, even with a child present, was fodder for gossip. Catherine knew what people were saying. She heard the whispers when she walked to the general store, saw the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, but she also saw Emma's face light up when James arrived. She felt the profound relief of finally being able to communicate with her daughter, and she recognized with some discomfort that she had begun to feel something more than gratitude toward the quiet man who had appeared in their lives. It was Reverend Cole who finally addressed the matter directly. He called on them one evening, his expression troubled and kind. "Catherine, I hope you know I speak only from concern. The town is talking about you and Mr. Coulter. I've defended your character, of course, but I'm worried about the situation. A widow must be above reproach. We're learning sign language," Catherine said, exhaustion creeping into her voice. "That's all. I understand. And it's wonderful that Emma has found a way to communicate. But perhaps the lessons could take place somewhere more public. The church parlor, perhaps. With a chaperone?" Catherine looked at Emma, who sat on her bed holding the carved bird, watching the conversation with intelligent eyes. She looked at the papers spread across the table, covered with sign language drawings. She thought about James's patient teaching, his gentle encouragement, the way he treated Emma with respect rather than pity. "No," she said quietly. "The lessons will continue as they are. This is my home, small as it is, and I'll invite who I choose into it." Reverend Cole sighed. "I feared you'd say that. Catherine, I don't want to see you hurt, or Emma hurt. This town can be unkind to those who don't follow its expectations. This town has already been unkind," Catherine said. "For 3 years, people have looked through us as if we don't exist. Emma has been ignored, dismissed, treated as if her silence makes her simple. Mr. Coulter is the first person who's seen her for who she really is. I won't give that up because people talk." After the Reverend left, Catherine sat at the table and pulled out the wedding ring she wore on a chain around her neck. She had removed it from her finger a year after Thomas died, unable to bear the weight of it, but unable to put it away completely. Now she held it in her palm, studying the simple gold band. Thomas would have liked James, she thought. They were similar men in some ways. Quiet, skilled with their hands, more comfortable with action than words. Thomas would have wanted Emma cared for, wanted Catherine to be happy. But was she betraying his memory by feeling warmth toward another man? By looking forward to Tuesday and Sunday afternoons? By noticing the way James's eyes crinkled when he smiled? Emma climbed down from her bed and came to stand beside Catherine. Her hands moved in a question Catherine had learned to recognize. "Are you sad?" "Just thinking," Catherine signed back. Her fingers were smoother now, more confident. Emma pointed to the ring, then to Catherine's heart. Then she signed something they had learned recently. "It's okay. Let go." Catherine's eyes filled. Her 8-year-old daughter, who had been trapped in silence for 3 years, was giving her permission to move forward. The wisdom of it, the generosity of it, broke something open in Catherine's chest. She pulled Emma close, holding her tight. Over her daughter's head, she looked at the carved bird on the shelf, at the papers full of signs, at the extra chair James had brought so they could all sit comfortably at the table. Her life was changing. She could feel it like the turn of seasons, inevitable and necessary. The widow she had been, frozen, isolated, barely surviving, was beginning to thaw. What would emerge she did not yet know. But for the first time in 3 years, she wanted to find out. That night, she tucked the ring away in the bottom of the trunk. Not discarded, not forgotten, simply put aside. A week later, Mrs. Henderson stopped Catherine on the street. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Brennan, but I won't be needing your services anymore. I've found someone else to do the embroidery work." Catherine's stomach dropped. "May I ask why? Was there something wrong with my work?" Mrs. Henderson had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Your work is fine, but several of my guests have expressed concern about your situation. I run a respectable establishment. I can't afford to be associated with scandal." 2 days later, Mrs. Hartwell delivered the same message. No more mending, no explanation beyond a pursed-lipped comment about maintaining standards. Catherine did the calculations that night by lamplight. Without Henderson's embroidery work and Hartwell's mending, she had lost nearly half her income. She had enough saved for perhaps 2 more months of rent. After that, nothing. When James came for their Sunday lesson, Catherine told him everything. The lost work, the dwindling funds, the impossible arithmetic of survival. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have a proposal. Hear me out before you answer." And Catherine, desperate and frightened and aware that she stood at a crossroads, agreed to listen. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning. chosen for its practicality rather than its romance. Reverend Cole performed the ceremony in his small office, his expression troubled but resigned. Doc Patterson stood as witness, his presence a quiet show of support that meant more to Catherine than she could express. Catherine wore her best dress, the one she saved for church. It was faded at the seams and let out twice to accommodate the years, but it was clean and pressed. James wore work clothes, clearly uncomfortable in anything formal. Emma stood between them in a new dress James had bought, simple blue cotton that matched her eyes. The vows were brief and businesslike. James's voice was steady as he promised to honor and provide. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she spoke her own promises to respect and partner. When Reverend Cole pronounced them married, James placed a simple gold band on Catherine's finger. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "She'd be glad to know it's being used." The weight of it surprised Catherine. Not the physical weight, but the significance. This was not a token hastily purchased. This was a family ring offered with meaning. She looked up at James, saw something in his eyes she had not seen before. Vulnerability, perhaps, or hope. There was no kiss. They shook hands formally, while Emma watched with solemn attention. Doc Patterson treated them to lunch at the hotel dining room, the closest thing to a wedding celebration they would have. Over roast beef and potatoes, he raised his glass of water in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, "and to the courage it takes to move forward." They clinked glasses, water for all of them, nothing fancy, nothing false. Just an acknowledgement of the step they had taken. The next 3 days were spent preparing for the move. James brought a wagon down from his cabin, and they loaded it with Catherine's few possessions. The furniture belonged to the room's owner, so they took only personal items. Clothes, sewing supplies, Emma's drawings, the carved bird, the river stone, Thomas's watch and photograph. The accumulation of 2 lives fit easily into a few boxes. Mrs. Hartwell watched from her store window as they loaded the wagon. She did not come out to offer congratulations or farewells. Neither did most of the town. Only Doc Patterson came to see them off, pressing a small parcel into Catherine's hands. "Medicine kit," he said. "Basic supplies and instructions for common ailments. You'll be far from town, and winter can be hard in the foothills. Best to be prepared." Catherine embraced him, fighting tears. "Thank you for everything. For treating us like people when no one else would. You are people," Doc Patterson said firmly. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The ride to James's cabin took most of the afternoon. They followed a rough track that climbed steadily into the foothills, leaving Cedar Falls behind in the valley below. The air grew cooler and sharper. Pines crowded close to the road, their scent heavy and clean. Emma sat between Catherine and James on the wagon seat, her eyes wide as she took in the mountains that had always been distant landmarks and now surrounded them. She signed questions constantly. "What's that bird? What made those tracks? How far are we going?" James answered each one patiently, sometimes stopping the wagon to point out features of the landscape. A deer trail, an eagle's nest high in a dead tree. The way you could read the weather by the shape of the clouds over the peaks. Catherine watched them interact, saw how naturally James had assumed the role of teacher and protector. Emma had already begun calling him by a sign they had created together, a combination of the letters J and C, formed in a way that also suggested mountain and strength. The cabin appeared as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. It sat in a clearing carved from pine forest, backed against a rocky slope, facing east to catch the morning light. Larger than Catherine had expected, 2 stories of solid log construction with a wide porch and a stone chimney. "You built this yourself?" Catherine asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Most of it," James said. "Had help with the roof and the heavy timber work. But yes, it's mine. Took 2 years of winters and summers." He helped them down from the wagon and led them inside. The first floor was open and spacious. A large fireplace dominated one wall. A solid table with benches stood in the center of the room. Kitchen area along one wall with a good stove and plenty of workspace. Shelves lined with dishes, supplies, tools. Everything neat, organized, clearly the work of someone who lived alone and valued order. A ladder led to the second floor. James climbed up, beckoning them to follow. The upper level had been divided into 2 rooms with a thin wall. "This one's yours and Emma's," James said, pushing open a door. "I've been working on it the past few weeks." Catherine stepped into a room that took her breath away. A real bed, larger than anything she had slept in for years, covered with a quilt in a pattern of stars. A smaller bed for Emma in the corner, also with fresh bedding. A chest of drawers, a mirror, a window that looked out over the clearing toward the mountains. "James," Catherine whispered, you didn't have to." "I wanted you to feel welcome," James said simply. "Not like a burden or an afterthought. You're my wife now, Catherine. This is your home." Emma ran to her bed and threw herself on it, bouncing slightly, her face radiant with joy. She signed rapidly, so fast Catherine caught only fragments. "Beautiful, so much space." "Can't believe it's ours." James showed them his room on the other side of the wall. Smaller, more Spartan, clearly furnished for function rather than comfort. A bed, a trunk, a small desk. "Nothing extra. We'll share the downstairs," James said. "Kitchen, fireplace, table. That's family space. Up here we each have privacy. Does that work for you?" Catherine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She had expected a cabin, rough, basic, adequate. Instead, James had prepared a home. He had thought about their comfort, their needs, their dignity. The care of it overwhelmed her. They spent the evening settling in. James cooked a simple supper. Venison stew he had prepared earlier, fresh bread, apples from a tree near the cabin. They ate at the big table, Emma between them, all of them exhausted but content, after Emma fell asleep in her new bed. Catherine and James sat by the fireplace, the flames casting moving shadows on the log walls. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable. "Thank you," Catherine said finally, "for all of this. It's more than I expected, more than I had any right to hope for." James stirred the fire, sending up sparks. "I meant what I said in the vows. I'll honor this commitment. You and Emma are under my protection now. I take that seriously." "I know you do." Catherine looked at the gold band on her finger, catching the firelight. "I'll do my part too. Keep the house cook, help with whatever needs doing. I want to be useful, not just taken care of." "You'll be both," James said. "Useful and cared for. That's what partnership means." They sat in silence a while longer, watching the fire burn down. Finally, Catherine stood. "I should check on Emma, get some sleep myself." "It's been a long day, Catherine." James stood as well. "I want you to know, this may have started as an arrangement, but I'm glad you're here. Both of you. The cabin's been quiet too long." "I'm glad too," Catherine said, and realized she meant it. "Good night, James." "Good night." She climbed the ladder to the second floor, checked on Emma, who slept soundly with the carved bird clutched in one hand. Then Catherine prepared for bed in the room that was now hers, in the house that was now home. Married to a man she barely knew, but was beginning to trust. She lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the cabin settling, the wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl. She touched the ring on her finger, not Thomas's ring, but one that carried its own history, its own meaning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Catherine felt something she had almost forgotten. Safe. 3 months passed like a long, slow exhale. Autumn painted the mountains in gold and crimson before winter arrived with its first dusting of snow. Catherine learned the rhythms of the cabin, waking to James's quiet movements as he prepared for timber work, spending days with Emma, exploring the clearing and the forest edges, evenings around the fireplace where they practiced signing, and James taught Emma to read by firelight. The arrangement worked better than Catherine had dared hope. James was easy to live with. He kept to his word about separate spaces, never presuming or pushing for more than they had agreed. But in the shared spaces, a comfortable domesticity developed. They cooked together sometimes. They talked in the evenings about the day's work, about Emma's progress, about the weather and the land and the small observations that made up daily life. Emma thrived. The silence of the forest suited her, and she explored with fearless curiosity. She learned to identify animal tracks, to read the sky for weather changes, to move through the woods without making a sound. James taught her practical skills, how to split kindling, how to bank a fire, how to carve simple shapes from wood. Catherine taught her letters and numbers, and Emma's quick mind absorbed everything. Slowly, carefully, something else developed too. Catherine found herself noticing things about James. The way his eyes crinkled when Emma made him laugh with one of her signed jokes. The gentleness in his hands when he guided Emma through a difficult carving. The steadiness of his presence, reliable as sunrise. She caught herself looking forward to the sound of his boots on the porch at the end of the workday. To the evenings when the three of them sat together in the warm circle of firelight. She did not name what she was feeling. It was too new, too fragile, too complicated by the memory of Thomas and the practical nature of their arrangement. But it was there, growing quietly like a seedling in good soil. Then, on a cold December morning, a rider came up the mountain track. James had already left for the timber site. Catherine was teaching Emma mathematics, using dried beans for counting when she heard hoofbeats. She moved to the window and saw a man on horseback, wearing a heavy coat and carrying saddlebags. Official-looking, not a social call. Catherine opened the door before he could knock. "Can I help you?" The man touched his hat brim. "Mrs. Coulter? I'm looking for Catherine Coulter, formerly Brennan. I'm Catherine Coulter. My name's Wesley Tucker. I'm a courier for the Territorial Land Office. I have a legal document that requires your signature." He dismounted and pulled papers from his saddlebag. "May I come in?" "It's a bit involved." Catherine's stomach tightened with instinctive dread. Nothing good ever came from official documents. But she stepped back and let him enter. Emma watched from the table, her hands moving in a question. "What's wrong?" "Nothing yet," Catherine signed back. "Stay there." Wesley Tucker spread papers across the table. Official seals, legal language, columns of numbers. Catherine's eyes struggled to make sense of it. "What is this about?" she asked. "It's a claim against your late husband's estate. A man named Clayton Moss has filed documentation showing that Thomas Brennan owed him a substantial sum at the time of his death. Mr. Moss is now claiming that debt from you as the widow and heir." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible. Thomas never mentioned any debt. According to these documents, your husband borrowed $800 from Mr. Moss for a business venture that failed. There's a promissory note here signed and witnessed. The debt was never repaid, and with interest accrued over 3 years, the total now stands at—" Tucker consulted the papers. $1,047. The numbers were impossible, staggering, more money than Catherine had seen in her entire life. "I don't have anything close to that amount," Catherine said. Her voice thin. "Mr. Moss is aware. He's proposing to settle the debt by taking ownership of your property. The homestead in Cedar Falls, which I understand you still own." The homestead. The small house where Emma had been born. The only thing of value Thomas had left them. The only inheritance Emma would ever have. Catherine had kept it, paying minimal taxes, unable to bear selling it. She had thought someday, when Emma was grown, she might want it, might want that connection to her father. "This can't be legal," Catherine said desperately. "I need to see proof. Real proof, not just papers a man brings to my door." Tucker's expression was sympathetic but firm. "These documents have been reviewed by the Territorial Court. The signatures match samples on file. The witnesses have given sworn statements. I'm sorry, Mrs. Coulter, but this appears to be legitimate. How long do I have?" "Mr. Moss is willing to give you 30 days to either pay the debt or sign over the property deed. After that, he'll pursue legal action for seizure." Tucker pulled out another paper. "This is notification of the claim. You need to sign it, acknowledging you've been informed." Catherine's hand shook as she signed her name. Tucker gathered the papers, offered more apologies she barely heard, and left. Catherine stood in the middle of the cabin, the notification paper in her hand, feeling her world tilt sideways. $800. A business venture? Thomas had never mentioned borrowing money, never mentioned any business beyond his carpentry work at the lumber mill. This had to be a mistake. Or worse, fraud. Emma came to her side, tugging at her sleeve. Her hands moved frantically. "Mama, what happened?" "What's wrong?" Catherine knelt and pulled Emma close. How to explain this? How to tell her daughter that someone was trying to take away the house where she was born, using her father's name to do it? She was still kneeling there holding Emma when James came home at midday to collect a tool he had forgotten. He took one look at Catherine's face and crossed the room in 3 strides. "What happened?" Catherine handed him the notification. James read it slowly, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he set it down with controlled care. "This is Clayton Moss. You know him?" "I know of him. He came through the timber camp a few months back, asking questions about land claims and property values. Nobody trusted him. He's got the look of a man who makes money off other people's misfortune." James read the document again. $800. "That's a considerable sum." "Thomas never borrowed money from anyone," Catherine said firmly. "He was careful about debt. He wouldn't have risked our home on some business venture without telling me. Then this is fraud." James's voice was flat, certain. "The question is whether we can prove it." James, this isn't your problem. This debt, if it's even real, it's against Thomas's estate, not yours." James looked at her steadily. "You're my wife. Emma's my responsibility now. That makes it my problem." He picked up the document. "Do you still have access to the homestead?" "Yes. I kept the key, but there's nothing there. We took everything valuable when we moved to town after Thomas died. Maybe not everything. If Thomas was as careful as you say, he would have kept records, business correspondence, maybe proof that this claim is false." James was already moving toward the door. "I'm going to Cedar Falls. I'll search the homestead, talk to people who knew Thomas, see what I can find out about Clayton Moss." "I'm coming with you," Catherine said. "You should stay here with Emma, where it's safe. That's my daughter's inheritance he's trying to steal. That's my husband's name being used for fraud." "I'm coming." James looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. We'll all go. Leave at first light tomorrow. Stay a night or 2 if needed. This needs to be dealt with quickly." That evening, Catherine could barely eat. The injustice of it burned in her chest. Someone was using Thomas's death, using their vulnerability, to steal the one thing of value they had left. And Clayton Moss had chosen his timing carefully, waiting until Catherine had remarried, until the town had written her off, until she seemed even more alone and powerless than before. But she was not alone anymore. She had James. And James, she was learning, was not a man who backed down from injustice. They left before dawn, the wagon packed for a few days away. The ride down the mountain was silent, each of them lost in thought. Emma sat between them, sensing the tension, her hand tight in Catherine's. The homestead sat on the eastern edge of Cedar Falls, a small house with a barn and a 1/4 acre of land. Catherine had not been back since they had moved to town 3 years ago. Seeing it now, with snow dusting the roof and weeds grown high around the door, broke something loose in her chest. This was where she had been happy, where Thomas had carried her over the threshold as a bride, where Emma had taken her first steps, where a whole life had been lived before grief swept it all away. James helped them down from the wagon. Catherine unlocked the door with hands that trembled. The interior was cold, dusty, empty. Their furniture was long gone, sold or moved to the room in town. But the structure remained. The fireplace where they had warmed themselves. The window where morning light had streamed in. The marks on the doorframe where Thomas had measured Emma's height each birthday. Where would he have kept papers? James asked gently. His workshop. In the barn. They crossed to the barn, their breath making clouds in the cold air. Thomas's workshop was at the back, a space he had claimed as his own. His workbench remained heavy and solid, too large to move easily. Tools had been taken, sold for money Catherine had needed to survive. But the bench itself stood like a monument to the man who had built it. James examined it carefully. He ran his hands along the underside, checking for hidden compartments. He pulled out drawers, looked behind them, tested for false backs. Nothing. Then Emma tugged at Catherine's sleeve. She pointed to the corner where Thomas had kept his tool roll, a leather case that held his specialized implements. It was gone, of course, but Emma signed something that made Catherine's heart jump. Letters, father's letters. In the tool roll. What's she saying? James asked. She remembers Thomas keeping letters in his tool roll. Correspondence with his sister, I think. Margaret, who lives in Kansas. Catherine felt hope flare. If Thomas wrote to Margaret about his business, about his concerns, where's the tool roll now? James asked. Catherine thought hard. After Thomas died, she had packed his personal items carefully, unable to bear throwing anything away. The tools themselves she had sold, but the roll, the trunk, she said suddenly. Back at the cabin. I packed it in the bottom of my trunk. I couldn't bear to look at it, so I put it away and tried to forget about it. James was already moving toward the door. Then we go back, now. If there's evidence in those letters, we need it before Moss's 30 days are up. They were back on the road within the hour, pushing the horses harder than was wise on the rough mountain track. Catherine held Emma close, her mind racing. Letters. What had Thomas written to his sister? Had he mentioned Clayton Moss? Had he documented anything that might prove fraud? They reached the cabin as sunset painted the western peaks in shades of fire and blood. James barely waited for the wagon to stop before jumping down and heading inside. Catherine and Emma followed, climbing the ladder to the second floor. Catherine pulled the trunk from beneath the bed and opened it with shaking hands. She moved aside clothes, the tintype photograph wrapped in tissue, small mementos of a life that seemed impossibly distant now. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, she found the leather tool roll. She brought it downstairs to the table. James lit more lamps, flooding the space with light. Catherine unrolled the leather carefully, and there, tucked into one of the pockets, she found them. Letters, a dozen or more in Margaret's neat handwriting, responses to letters Thomas must have sent. Catherine's hands shook as she unfolded the first one. James read over her shoulder, both of them scanning quickly. The early letters were family news, updates on Margaret's children, questions about Emma's growth. Then the tone shifted. One letter, dated 6 months before Thomas's death, caught Catherine's attention. "I'm relieved to hear you got your money back from that man Moss," Margaret had written. "I was worried when you told me you'd lent him $300. I know you believed in his lumber scheme, but I never trusted a man who promises quick returns. You were wise to demand repayment when his first deadline passed. At least you lost nothing but time." Catherine read it again, then looked up at James. "He lent Moss money, not the other way around." James flipped through more letters. Another one, dated 3 months before Thomas's death, made his jaw tighten. "Be careful of that Moss character," Margaret had written. "You mentioned he was pressing you to invest more, claiming he'd found a new opportunity. Thomas, you already helped him once and he barely paid you back. Some men see kindness as weakness. Don't let him take advantage of your good nature." And then the final letter, unfinished, found loose among the others. In Thomas's handwriting, dated the day he died. "Dear Margaret," it began, "I'm writing to warn you about a man named Clayton Moss. He came to me today demanding I invest in another of his schemes. When I refused, he became angry and threatening. He said he'd find a way to get what he was owed, even though I've never owed him anything. He's the type who'll twist truth into lies if it serves him. I'm going to document everything in case he causes trouble. I won't let him threaten my family's security." The letter ended there. Thomas had gone to work that day. He had died saving another man's life. He had never finished his warning. Catherine felt tears stream down her face. He knew. Thomas knew Moss was dangerous. He was trying to protect us. James gathered the letters carefully. "This is proof. Thomas lent Moss money, not the other way around. And Thomas was planning to document Moss's threats. This promissory note Moss is using, it has to be a forgery. But how do we prove it?" Catherine asked. "His documents looked official. He had witnesses. Then we'll need better evidence." James's expression was grim and determined. "And we'll need to move quickly. Moss chose his timing for a reason. He thought you'd be isolated, friendless, unable to fight back. He didn't count on you having someone who'd stand with you." Catherine looked at this man she had married for convenience, for security, for practical reasons. This man who was now gathering evidence like a soldier preparing for battle, whose jaw was set with determination, whose eyes promised that he would not let this injustice stand. "Thank you," she whispered. James met her gaze. "You're my family now. Both of you. Nobody threatens my family." And Catherine felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been frozen for 3 years, beginning to thaw. Something that might, given time, be named love. James spent the next 3 days investigating Clayton Moss with methodical thoroughness. He rode to Cedar Falls each morning, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, his face drawn with exhaustion and anger. Catherine waited, kept the cabin warm, cared for Emma, and tried not to let fear consume her. On the 3rd evening, James returned with Doc Patterson. The doctor looked grim as he climbed down from his buggy, a worn leather satchel in his hand. "I asked Doc to come up," James said as they entered the cabin. "He has information we need to hear." They sat around the table while Emma played quietly in the corner, sensing the adults needed privacy. Doc Patterson spread papers across the wood surface, notes, records, copies of documents. "I did some digging," he said. "Called in favors from colleagues in other territories. Clayton Moss has done this before. At least 4 times that I can confirm, probably more. Always the same pattern. He targets widows with property, claims the deceased husband owed him money, produces documents that look legitimate, and pressures them to sign over property rather than face lengthy legal battles they can't afford." Catherine's hands clenched into fists. "How does he get away with it?" "Because most widows can't fight back," Doc Patterson said bluntly. "They have no money for lawyers, no one to stand up for them. No way to prove fraud when he's had months or years to prepare his false documentation. By the time anyone realizes what happened, Moss has sold the property and moved on to the next territory." "But we have Thomas's letters," Catherine said. "We have proof he lent Moss money, not the other way around." "That's good," Doc Patterson said. "But it's not enough. Moss's forgery is sophisticated. He's got what appears to be Thomas's signature on a promissory note, witnessed by 2 men who've since left the territory. Conveniently impossible to question. He's filed his claim through proper legal channels, paid the filing fees, followed procedure. On paper, his case looks airtight." James leaned forward. "What do we need to prove it's fraud?" "We need to demonstrate that the signature is forged," Doc Patterson said. "Or we need witnesses who can testify that Thomas never borrowed money from Moss. Or ideally, we need to catch Moss in a lie so obvious the territorial judge can't ignore it." "The territorial judge," Catherine said. "When does he arrive?" "Circuit Court convenes in Cedar Falls in 2 weeks, Doc Patterson said. "That's our window. If we can present evidence before the judge, we might stop this. But if Moss gets a judgment in his favor, it becomes much harder to fight." James stood and paced to the fireplace. "I talked to people in town. The few who remember Thomas at all remember him as honest, careful with money. But it's been 3 years. Memories fade, and most people don't want to get involved in legal disputes." "Mrs. Hartwell remembers," Catherine said bitterly. "She remembers everything about everyone." "Actually," Doc Patterson said slowly, "that might be useful. Mrs. Hartwell was Thomas's landlord before you bought the homestead, wasn't she? She'd have records of his payments, his financial reliability. And she's notoriously meticulous about documentation." Catherine felt a flicker of hope. "She is. She keeps ledgers going back decades." "Then we need to talk to her," James said. "Get her to testify about Thomas's character, his financial habits. It's not proof, but it establishes a pattern that contradicts Moss's claims." "She won't help us," Catherine said. "She made her opinion of me very clear when I lost her business. She might help Thomas's memory," Doc Patterson said. "And she might be willing to stand against fraud, even if she doesn't particularly care for you personally. Mrs. Hartwell has her own reputation to consider. She won't want to be seen as someone who let a widow be cheated." Over the next week, they built their case piece by piece. James rode back to the homestead and searched more thoroughly, finding additional evidence, receipts Thomas had saved, a ledger documenting his carpentry income, notes about various projects. Everything painted a picture of a careful man who lived within his means and avoided debt. Doc Patterson interviewed people who had known Thomas, collecting statements about his character. Reverend Cole provided a letter attesting to Thomas's honesty. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had dismissed Catherine from her employment, agreed to state that Thomas had always paid his debts promptly. The hardest conversation was with Mrs. Hartwell. Catherine and James went together, presenting their case in the back room of her store. Mrs. Hartwell listened with her usual pinched expression, examining the letters from Margaret, the receipts, the ledger entries. Thomas Brennan was an honest man, she said finally. Paid his rent on time, never gave me a moment's trouble. If this Moss character is claiming otherwise, he's lying. She looked at Catherine with something that might have been grudging respect. I may not approve of all your choices, Mrs. Coulter, but I won't stand by and watch a dead man's reputation destroyed for profit. I'll testify. Thank you, Catherine said, meaning it despite their history. Mrs. Hartwell waved her off. Don't thank me. I'm doing this for Thomas, not for you. And because I don't like strangers coming into my town and trying to cheat people. It's bad for business. They also discovered something crucial about Moss's witnesses. James tracked down one of them, a drifter who had apparently signed the promissory note as a witness. The man was found in a saloon 2 towns over, drunk and willing to talk for the price of a bottle. Moss paid me $20 to sign my name, the man admitted. Said it was just a formality for a business deal. I never saw Thomas Brennan, never witnessed him sign nothing. Moss just needed names on paper. Said it didn't matter because the debt was legitimate. I figured $20 was $20. James got the man to sign an affidavit, witnessed by a local sheriff, admitting the fraud. It was damning evidence, but they still needed more. They needed something that would make the case undeniable. Catherine spent the evenings copying Thomas's letters in her careful hand, preserving the evidence in case something happened to the originals. Emma helped, drawing pictures of the scenes her mother described. Her father at his workbench, the homestead in happier times, the family they had been. One night, as Catherine worked by lamplight, James sat across from her, watching her face. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. The homestead, it's a piece of land. We have the cabin. We have a home. You could let it go. Catherine set down her pen. It's not about the land. It's about Emma's inheritance. It's about Thomas's memory being used for fraud. It's about standing up to someone who preys on widows because he thinks we're too weak to fight back. She met James's eyes. And it's about not letting men like Moss win. James nodded slowly. I understand. But I need you to know, whatever happens with the homestead, you and Emma are secure. The cabin is yours. My income is yours. You'll never be left vulnerable again. Something in his voice made Catherine's breath catch. James, I know what we agreed, he said. I know this was supposed to be an arrangement, nothing more. But Catherine, these past months, he paused, seeming to struggle for words. Having you here, having Emma here, it's changed things for me. This doesn't feel like an arrangement anymore. It feels like family. Like home. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. It feels that way to me, too, she admitted. I didn't expect it. I thought I'd buried that part of myself with Thomas. But you've been everything you promised and more. You've been kind and patient and steady. You've treated Emma like your own daughter. You've made us feel safe. I care about you, James said simply. Both of you. More than I expected to. More than I probably should, given how this started. Catherine reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. Maybe we both need to stop apologizing for what we feel. Maybe we need to accept that sometimes things change, and that's not betraying anyone. It's just living. They sat there in the lamplight, hands joined, the weight of the coming confrontation hanging over them, but the warmth between them undeniable. Emma looked up from her drawings and smiled, seeing them together. She signed something that made them both laugh. Finally, she said, you're holding hands like people who like each other. The night before the circuit court convened, they made their final preparations. James had arranged for them to present their case publicly, not just to the judge in chambers, but to the whole town. Doc Patterson had suggested it. Make it public, he said. Let everyone see the evidence. Make it hard for Moss to slink away if things go badly. Catherine packed the letters carefully in a leather folder. She included the ledgers, the receipts, the affidavit from the false witness, the character statements from townspeople, everything that might prove Thomas's innocence and Moss's guilt. She also packed the tin-type photograph, Thomas, herself, and baby Emma. She wanted the judge to see the family Moss was trying to rob, wanted everyone to see what was at stake. That night, Catherine barely slept. She lay in her bed, listening to Emma's quiet breathing from across the room, thinking about tomorrow, about standing in front of the town that had shunned her, about facing down a man who had made a career of victimizing widows, about the possibility of losing, of watching Thomas's memory tarnished and Emma's inheritance stolen. But she also thought about James's steady presence, about the way he had investigated tirelessly, building their case piece by piece, about the determination in his eyes when he promised to stand beside her, about the fact that she was not alone anymore. Just before dawn, she heard movement from James's room. She rose quietly and found him already dressed, standing by the window, looking out at the darkness, slowly giving way to grey light. Couldn't sleep either. Catherine asked. "Too much at stake," James said. He turned to her. "Are you ready?" Catherine thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. Thomas's death, 3 years of silence and struggle, the unexpected appearance of a mountain man who signed to her daughter, a practical marriage that had become something more. And now this, a fight for justice, for dignity, for the right to be heard. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." They woke Emma gently. She dressed in her good dress, the blue one James had bought for the wedding. Catherine wore her best as well, wanting to present themselves with dignity. They were not victims, despite what Moss thought. They were a family, standing together. The ride down to Cedar Falls took 2 hours. The town was already stirring when they arrived, people gathering at the church where the circuit judge would hold court. Word had spread about the case, widow versus land speculator, fraud versus justice. It promised drama, and frontier towns were always hungry for drama. Catherine saw Clayton Moss standing near the church steps. He was a well-dressed man in his late 40s, with slicked hair and a confident bearing. When he saw Catherine, he smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made her blood run hot with anger. "Mrs. Coulter," he said, tipping his hat, "I'm glad you've come to settle this matter. If you'll just sign the deed transfer, we can avoid all this unpleasantness." James stepped between them. "She's not signing anything. We'll present our case to the judge." Moss's smile widened. "Of course. Though I should warn you, I have ironclad documentation. This will only embarrass you further. But please, by all means, waste the court's time." Doc Patterson met them at the church door. "The judge is ready. The whole town's here. Catherine, are you sure you want to do this publicly?" Catherine looked at the crowd gathering, Mrs. Hartwell, Reverend Cole, Mrs. Henderson, people she knew and people she didn't, people who had helped and people who had turned away. The town that had judged her, dismissed her, forgotten her. "I'm sure," she said. "Let them all hear the truth." They entered the church together, James, Catherine, Emma, and Doc Patterson. The townspeople filled the pews. At the front, behind Reverend Cole's pulpit, sat the territorial judge, a stern-looking man in his 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Judge Harrison called the court to order. "We're here to adjudicate a debt claim filed by Clayton Moss against the estate of Thomas Brennan, now represented by his widow, Catherine Coulter. Mr. Moss, present your case." Moss stood, confidence radiating from every gesture. He laid out his claim smoothly, the loan made to Thomas, the failed business venture, the signed promissory note. He presented his forged documents with practiced ease, his false witnesses' sworn statements, reading into the record. It sounded convincing. Catherine felt her stomach twist. Even knowing it was all lies, hearing it stated so authoritatively made her doubt. What if their evidence wasn't enough? What if the judge believed Moss's polished presentation over their collection of old letters and character statements? Then Judge Harrison looked at Catherine. "Mrs. Coulter, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Catherine stood. Her legs felt unsteady, but Emma's hand squeezed hers, and James's presence behind her was solid as stone. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying across the silent church. "I wish to prove that every word Mr. Moss has said is a lie." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his attention sharpening. "Those are serious accusations, Mrs. Coulter. I hope you have evidence to support them." "I do, Your Honor." Catherine's voice grew stronger. She gestured to James, who brought forward the leather folder containing their documents. "My late husband kept careful records of his finances. He also maintained correspondence with his sister in Kansas. These letters tell a very different story than the one Mr. Moss has presented." She began with Thomas's ledger, showing the judge entries that documented every penny earned and spent. "My husband was meticulous. He recorded everything: carpentry jobs, payments received, household expenses. There is no entry anywhere in this ledger showing a loan received from Clayton Moss or any other person." Moss shifted in his seat, but maintained his confident expression. "A man doesn't always record his debts, especially if he's ashamed of a failed business venture." "My husband had nothing to be ashamed of," Catherine said sharply. Then, forcing her voice back to calm, she continued, "But more telling than what's not in the ledger is what is here." She showed the judge an entry from 4 years prior. "This shows a payment made to Clayton Moss, $300. The notation reads, 'Loan repayment plus interest.' My husband didn't borrow from Mr. Moss. He lent to him." A murmur ran through the church. Moss's smile tightened. Judge Harrison examined the ledger carefully. "This is interesting, but it's not conclusive. Mr. Moss could argue this represents a different transaction." "Then let me present additional evidence," Catherine said. She pulled out Margaret's letters, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice steady. "These are letters from my husband's sister, Margaret Brennan Wesley, who lives in Lawrence, Kansas. I'll read the relevant portions." She read the passages about Thomas lending Moss money, about his concern when Moss was slow to repay, about Margaret's warnings against trusting Moss with further investment. With each letter, each dated entry, the story became clearer. Thomas had been the lender, not the borrower. And more, Thomas had recognized Moss as untrustworthy. "Finally," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion, "there is this." She held up the unfinished letter in Thomas's handwriting. "My husband wrote this the day he died. He never finished it because he went to work and never came home. But in it, he clearly states that Clayton Moss was demanding more money, making threats, and that Thomas intended to document everything because he feared Moss would cause trouble." She handed the letter to Judge Harrison. The courtroom was absolutely silent as the judge read it. When he looked up, his expression had changed. "Mr. Moss, this letter directly contradicts your testimony. It suggests that not only did Thomas Brennan not owe you money, but that you were actually harassing him for additional funds." Moss stood abruptly. "That letter is convenient, isn't it? Appearing just when Mrs. Coulter needs evidence? How do we know it's genuine? How do we know she didn't write it herself?" "Because," Doc Patterson said, rising from his seat, "I have seen Thomas Brennan's handwriting numerous times. I treated him after a workshop accident 2 years before his death, and he signed medical forms. I can verify that the handwriting in this letter matches those signatures." Mrs. Hartwell stood as well. "I also can verify Thomas's handwriting. He signed rent receipts for me monthly when he lived in my property. That letter is his hand, no question." Catherine felt a surge of gratitude for these unlikely allies. But she wasn't finished. "Your Honor, there's one more piece of evidence. Mr. Moss's promissory note claims to have been witnessed by 2 men, Jacob Wheeler and Samuel Cross. We located Mr. Wheeler." James stepped forward with the affidavit. "Jacob Wheeler is currently in Bennett County. He signed this statement before a sheriff, admitting that Clayton Moss paid him $20 to sign his name as a witness. He never saw Thomas Brennan sign anything. He was paid to add legitimacy to a forged document." The murmur in the church grew louder. Judge Harrison took the affidavit and read it with an expression of cold anger. When he looked at Moss, his voice could have cut glass. "Mr. Moss, do you have anything to say to these allegations?" For the first time, Moss's confidence wavered. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted toward the door, as if calculating whether he could simply leave. But the church was packed. and James stood between him and the exit, arms crossed, looking like he very much hoped Moss would try to run. "The affidavit is meaningless," Moss said, but his voice had lost its smooth assurance. "The man's a drunk. He'd say anything for money. He said he signed your false document for money," Judge Harrison said coldly. Which appears to be exactly what happened. Catherine felt victory within reach. But she also felt Emma tugging at her sleeve. She looked down at her daughter, whose hands were moving in urgent signs. "I need to say something," Emma signed. "I need to tell them." "Please, Mama, let me speak." Spring arrived in the mountains with a rush of meltwater and returning birds. Catherine stood on the porch of the cabin, watching Emma chase butterflies through the clearing, her laughter, actual sound, actual voice, ringing clear in the mountain air. 5 months had passed since the trial. Emma's voice had returned gradually, hesitantly at first, like a muscle remembering how to work. She still signed more than she spoke, still retreated into silence when overwhelmed. But the voice was there now, available when she needed it. The doctors called it a miracle. Catherine called it justice. Emma had needed to speak the truth about her father, and speaking the truth had unlocked what grief had closed. The homestead had sold to a young family from back east, eager for a fresh start. The money Catherine received, far more than Moss had tried to steal, now sat in the territorial bank, marked for Emma's future, for education, for a trade, for whatever path she chose when she was grown. Thomas's legacy preserved and protected. Catherine had used a portion of the money to buy a new family Bible, a substantial volume with a leather cover and gilt-edged pages. Inside the front cover, she had written 4 names in careful script. First, Thomas Brennan, with his dates of birth and death and the words, "Beloved husband and father, man of honor." Then, below, James Coulter, Catherine Coulter, and Emma Brennan Coulter, a family that honored the past while building the future. The Bible sat on a shelf James had built, alongside Emma's carved bird, the riverstone from Doc Patterson, and the silver compass James had given Catherine after the trial. "Sarah gave it to me so I'd always find my way home," he had said. "Now you and Emma are home. It belongs with our family treasures." Catherine turned at the sound of boots on the porch steps. James climbed up, his work clothes dusty from a morning at the timber site, his face creased with the lines of a man who smiled more these days. He carried something wrapped in cloth. "Package came up with the supply wagon," he said, handing it to her. "From Kansas." Catherine's heart quickened. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing another letter from Margaret and a small box. The letter was brief. "Dear Catherine, James, and Emma," it read. "I was overjoyed to hear about the trial's outcome, and furious that Clayton Moss tried to use my brother's memory for such wickedness. I'm grateful Emma found her voice to defend her father's honor. Thomas would be so proud of her courage. I'm sending something that belonged to Thomas, something I've kept all these years. I think it's time it went home to his daughter. With love, Margaret." Catherine opened the box. Inside, nested in tissue paper, was a pocket watch, not the one Thomas had carried, which Catherine still wound daily, but an older one. His father's watch passed down through the family. The inscription inside read, "To my son Thomas, may you always know what time it is and make the most of every hour." Catherine felt tears sting her eyes. She would add this to Emma's inheritance, another connection to the father she was old enough now to remember and honor. Emma came running up to the porch, her face flushed with exercise. "Mama, can we work on the rocking chair? James said we could finish it today." "After lunch," Catherine said, smoothing Emma's hair back. The girl's voice still caught her by surprise sometimes. Still felt like a gift she had not dared to hope for. They ate together at the big table, the 3 of them, and the empty chair where a 4th would sit in autumn. Catherine was 4 months along now, the pregnancy beginning to show. A son, Doc Patterson predicted, though he freely admitted he was often wrong about such things. Boy or girl, the baby would be loved, would grow up in a house filled with sign language and spoken words, with 2 parents who had learned that love could look different than expected and still be real. After lunch, they worked on the rocking chair in James's workshop, an addition he had built onto the cabin specifically for teaching Emma woodworking. The chair was nearly finished, crafted from pine and aspen, with a seat that rocked smooth and true. Emma had helped with every step, her father's gift for working with wood emerging under James's patient instruction. "Your father would love seeing you do this," James said, as Emma sanded the chair's arm. "He'd love knowing you're learning his craft. Tell me about him again," Emma said. It was a request she made often these days, wanting to gather memories before they faded completely. Catherine and James both told stories. Catherine about Thomas's kindness and humor. James about what the townspeople remembered, what the ledgers and letters revealed about the man he had been. He was brave, James said, like his daughter. He stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. And he loved your mother and you more than anything in the world. "I miss him," Emma said simply, "but I'm glad I have you too." "Is that okay? To miss my father, but also love my new father." James set down his tools and knelt beside Emma. His hands moved in the sign they had taught her early on. "Heart big enough for everyone? Your heart is big enough to love everyone," he said aloud. "Your father Thomas, who gave you life and his name, and me, who's honored to help raise you. Love doesn't run out, Emma. It multiplies." That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Catherine and James sat on the porch watching stars emerge over the mountains. Catherine wore both rings now, Thomas's on her right hand, James's on her left. She no longer felt she had to choose between past and present. They were all part of the same story, the same life. "I never expected this," Catherine said, leaning into James's warmth. "When you got off that stage and signed to Emma, I never imagined it would lead here." "Neither did I," James admitted. "I thought I'd teach you some signs, maybe help a little, then go back to my solitary mountain life. Instead," he gestured at the cabin, at the life they had built. "I found myself again, found a reason to come down from the mountain." "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked. "The arrangement we made? The practical marriage that wasn't supposed to be about love?" James took her hand, his thumb tracing the ring he had placed there. "I regret nothing. This you and Emma and the baby coming, this is more than I thought I'd ever have again. It's not the same as what I had with Sarah. It's its own thing, its own kind of love. But it's real, Catherine. It's real and it's good." "Yes," Catherine agreed. "It is." Above them, stars wheeled in ancient patterns. Below, in the valley, Cedar Falls settled into its evening rhythms. But here on this mountain porch, a family sat together in comfortable silence, a silence that no longer felt like loss, but like peace. Emma had taught them that. Silence could be many things. It could be isolation and grief, or it could be understanding, communication beyond words, the kind of deep knowing that came from truly seeing each other. The mountain man, who had appeared on a dusty platform 6 months ago, had seen them, really seen them, when the rest of the world looked away. And in seeing them, he had saved them, not just from poverty or fraud, though he had done that too, but from the deeper poverty of isolation, the fraud of believing they had to face the world alone. Catherine thought about the girl she had been, sitting on that platform day after day, invisible and voiceless in her own way. She thought about the woman she had become, stronger, braver, more sure of her place in the world. She thought about Emma, who had found not one voice but two, the voice of her hands and the voice of her heart. And she thought about James, the quiet man who had walked into their lives carrying an unexpected gift. The gift of being seen, the gift of being heard, the gift of belonging. In the unforgiving West, where survival often meant hardening your heart, they had found something softer and more enduring. They had found what so many searched for and never discovered, a place to call home, people to call family, and a love built not on passion's first fire, but on something more lasting, understanding, respect, the quiet certainty of standing together against whatever came. Next, Catherine closed her eyes and let herself feel it all. Gratitude for Thomas, who had given her Emma and shown her what love could be. Gratitude for James, who had shown her that love could come again in different form. Gratitude for Emma, whose courage had saved them all. and gratitude for this moment, this ordinary evening on a mountain porch, which held more grace than she had any right to expect. "What are you thinking about?" James asked softly. Catherine opened her eyes and smiled. "I'm thinking that we're blessed, that despite everything, the grief, the struggle, the fear, we're exactly where we're supposed to be." "I believe that too," James said. From inside the cabin came a small sound, Emma calling out in her sleep. Both Catherine and James rose immediately, moving toward their daughter. Some instincts ran deeper than thought, deeper than words. The instinct to protect, to comfort, to be there when needed. Emma was sitting up in bed, her eyes open but not quite awake. Catherine sat beside her, stroking her hair, while James lit the lamp with gentle hands. "Just a dream, sweetheart," Catherine murmured. Emma's eyes focused, recognizing them both. She signed sleepily, then spoke the words aloud, her voice small but clear. "I dreamed Papa Thomas was here. He said to tell you he's glad. Glad you're happy. Glad I have James now. He said his job was done right." Catherine's throat tightened. She looked at James over Emma's head and saw her own tears reflected in his eyes. "Your papa loved you very much," James said, signing as he spoke. "He'd want you to be happy, to be safe, to have a good life. That's what we all want for you." Emma nodded, already drifting back to sleep. "I know, I love you both. All three of you. Papa Thomas in my memories, and you two here with me." She curled back into her blankets, clutching the carved bird James had made her all those months ago. Catherine and James stood watching her for a long moment. This child who had taught them both so much about courage and resilience and the many forms love could take. They returned to the porch, to their place under the stars. But now, James's arm was around Catherine's shoulders, and her hand rested on the place where their baby grew. The night air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of summer. "Do you think he's really at peace?" Catherine asked. "Thomas, I mean, do you think he'd truly approve of all this?" "I think," James said carefully, "that a man who died saving another man's life, who worked hard and loved his family and tried to do right, that man would want the people he loved to go on living. Not just surviving, but truly living, finding joy where they could, building something good from the wreckage." "You're probably right," Catherine said. She leaned her head against James's shoulder, feeling the steady strength of him, the reliability that had become as necessary to her as breathing. "Sarah would want the same for you, wouldn't she?" "She would," James agreed. "Sarah was practical about love. She said once that love wasn't a scarce resource you had to hoard. It was something that grew when you shared it. The more you gave, the more there was." He paused. "I didn't understand what she meant then. I do now." They sat in companionable quiet, watching the night deepen. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges and the ordinary struggles of life in the mountains. But tonight was for reflection, for counting blessings, for acknowledging how far they had come. Catherine thought about the journey that had brought them here, the loss and grief that had felt insurmountable, the loneliness of those years after Thomas died, sitting on that platform day after day with Emma, invisible to a world that had no place for them. The moment when a stranger knelt before her daughter and spoke in signs, opening a door Catherine had not known existed. She thought about the fear of accepting James's proposal, the uncertainty of building a life with someone she barely knew, the gradual discovery that partnership could become friendship, and friendship could become something deeper, the trial that had forced them all to fight together, to defend not just property, but dignity and truth. And she thought about Emma, finding her voice by defending her father's memory, speaking the truth that needed to be spoken, no matter how hard, showing them all what courage looked like when it mattered most. "We should write all this down," Catherine said suddenly. Emma's story. How she lost her voice and found it again. How we found each other. So someday, when she's grown and has children of her own, she'll have it. The whole story. "That's a good idea," James said. "You could write it. You have a way with words." "We'll write it together," Catherine said. "You and me and Emma, all our voices, all our perspectives. That's what makes it true." James squeezed her shoulder in agreement. "We'll start tomorrow, but tomorrow could wait. Tonight, was for sitting together under stars that had watched over these mountains long before they arrived and would continue long after they were gone. Tonight was for feeling the baby move beneath Catherine's hand, for thinking about the family they were becoming, for believing in futures that seemed impossible just months before. The wind stirred the pines, carrying the sound of the river in the valley below. An owl called from the forest. Inside the cabin, Emma slept peacefully, her nightmares fading. Her voice, both the one in her hands and the one in her throat, secure and strong. Catherine took a deep breath of mountain air and let herself feel what she had not allowed herself to feel in 3 long years. Not just survival, not just getting through each day, but actual genuine happiness. The kind that came from being seen and known and valued. The kind that came from having someone to lean on and someone who leaned on you in return. The kind that came from watching your child flourish, from building something real out of loss and fear. "Thank you," she said to James, "for everything, for seeing Emma when no one else did, for standing with us, for making us family." "Thank you for trusting me," James replied, "for giving me a reason to come down from the mountain, for reminding me that life is worth living even after loss." They sat there until the stars wheeled toward midnight, until the cold drove them inside to the warmth of the cabin, to the life they had built together through patience and courage and unexpected grace. As they climbed the ladder to the second floor, Catherine paused to look at the family Bible on its shelf, at the names inscribed inside that told their story in the simplest terms: Thomas, James, Catherine, Emma, and soon, one more name to add, a family forged from sorrow and hope in equal measure. A family that proved love was not a finite resource, but something that multiplied when shared. A family that understood silence could be as eloquent as speech, that sign language and spoken words were both valid voices, that what mattered was not how you communicated, but that you tried. Catherine climbed into bed beside Emma, who had made her way to her mother's room in the night, as she sometimes did. James stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, his wife, his daughter, his family. Then he moved to his own room, close enough to be there if needed, separate enough to give them space. The arrangement they had made, refined and reshaped by time, into something that worked. In the darkness, Catherine reached for Thomas's watch on the bedside table and wound it by touch, her fingers knowing the mechanism by heart. This nightly ritual still connected her to the past, still honored the man who had given her so much. But now it felt different, not an anchor holding her in place, but a bridge connecting past to present to future. She set the watch down and gathered Emma closer. The girl murmured in her sleep and settled against her mother's warmth. Outside, the mountains stood patient and eternal. Inside, a family slept secure, and on a dusty platform in Cedar Falls, where this story began, other travelers came and went, other lives intersected briefly before moving on. But somewhere in the collective memory of that small frontier town, people remembered. They remembered the widow and her mute daughter, who had been invisible until a mountain man taught them to see. They remembered the trial where a child found her voice to speak truth. They remembered that sometimes the most unexpected connections led to the deepest bonds. The story would be told and retold, changing slightly with each telling but holding on to its essential truth. That in the unforgiving West, compassion still mattered. That seeing someone, truly seeing them, could change everything. That families came in many forms, and love did not follow a single path, and that sometimes, when you felt most alone, most invisible, most voiceless, that was when grace arrived. In the form of a stranger who signed to your daughter. In the form of courage you did not know you possessed. In the form of a future you had not dared to imagine. Catherine closed her eyes and let sleep come, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. But whatever came, they would face it together, speaking, signing, and sometimes resting in the comfortable silence of those who truly understood each other. The mountain man who had spoken her daughter's language had given them more than communication. He had given them connection, community, and a place to belong. He had shown them that even in the hardest times, even in the loneliest places, even when the world seemed determined to overlook you, you could find your voice, your family, your home. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.